For 8 years, I sacrificed everything to save $48,000 for my first home. I skipped vacations, drove a car with 190,000 miles on it, and worked double shifts until my feet throbbed. But 3 weeks ago, I stood frozen in the dark hallway of my mother's house and heard her promise every single cent of it to my brother Tyler. She didn't even ask me. To her, my entire future was just a convenient safety net for her favorite child. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on them and left them to face the consequences of their own choices, I need you to understand exactly how we got here. Because looking back, the signs were always there. I was just too blind, or maybe too desperate for my mother's love, to see them. Welcome back to Reddit Drama Stories, where sometimes the people who think they can reach into your pocket find out the pocket was sewn shut long before they ever got there. Drop a comment below and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of quiet, prepared justice. My name is Natalie Cross. I'm 34 years old and I work as a physical therapist at an inpatient rehabilitation center that treats more than 200 patients a week. I spend my days teaching stroke survivors how to walk again, helping accident victims regain their grip strength, and calmly talking down patients who are in so much pain they want to give up entirely. That ability to stay calm while someone is screaming at me or about me is the only reason I survived my family. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial on a street called Willowbrook Lane in a small Ohio town where the biggest event of the year was the high school football championship, and the local credit union had been on Main Street since 1952. My father, Richard, was a high school history teacher who spent his evenings grading papers at the kitchen table and rarely spoke unless my mother asked him a direct question. My mother, Patricia, was the engine of the household. She ran the church rummage sale, organized the neighborhood block party, and made sure everyone within a 3-mile radius knew that her son, Tyler, was destined for greatness. Tyler was born when I was 3, and from the moment he arrived, the hierarchy of our family was set in stone. I was the responsible one, the helper, the child who could be counted on to set the table and fold the laundry and finish her homework without being asked. Tyler was the star, the one who needed things, special tutoring, expensive sports equipment, endless second chances, and my mother's entire identity was built around providing them. There was a wall calendar in our kitchen, one of those big spiral-bound ones with a different nature photograph at the top of every month. My mother used it to track everything that mattered. And every single month, without fail, Tyler's activities filled up the squares first. His soccer practices, his band concerts, his parent-teacher conferences, his orthodontist appointments. Anything I needed. A ride to my science fair, a permission slip signed, a check for a field trip, was squeezed into whatever space was left, usually in pencil, usually erased and rewritten 3 times before the day actually arrived. I remember one specific week in October when I was 12. I had a regional spelling bee on Saturday morning, and I'd been practicing for months. On Wednesday, I reminded my mother about it, and she nodded and said she'd write it on the calendar. When I checked the calendar on Friday night, the square for Saturday was completely full with Tyler's soccer tournament schedule. 3 games, all written in blue Sharpie, with little stars next to the times. My spelling bee wasn't on there at all. I walked to the library by myself the next morning, competed, placed 3rd, and walked home with a small trophy that nobody asked to see. The financial version of that calendar was a savings account that my mother opened for Tyler when he was 10 years old. It was a custodial account at the County Educators Credit Union, seeded with $300 from a Christmas bonus my father received, and my mother added to it every single month, $50 here, $100 there. While she told anyone who'd listen that Tyler was going to be an entrepreneur, that he had the spark, that he just needed a little help getting started. No such account was ever opened for me. When I asked her about it at age 13, after I'd found Tyler's passbook on the kitchen counter, with its neatly printed balance climbing past $2,000, She looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression and said, "Oh, Natalie, you don't need a special account. You're so responsible with money. You'll figure out your own way." I absorbed that sentence the way I absorbed everything. Silently, completely, filing it away in the growing archive of evidence that my needs were not the ones that mattered. I confused being low maintenance with being unimportant, and I carried that confusion into adulthood like a spine. When I turned 18, my mother took me to that same credit union to open my first checking and savings accounts. She told me it would be easier if she were a joint owner, so she could help me manage things and transfer money if I ever had an emergency. I was a teenager who had just graduated high school, who still wanted, on some deep and stubborn level, to believe that her mother's offer of help was a form of love. I signed the signature card without reading the fine print. The account, a high-yield savings account, with an interest rate of 1.9% that had been grandfathered in from an old promotion, was officially a joint account with full rights of survivorship. Both our names on it, both our social security numbers linked to it, account number 412-5587. For the next 16 years, every dollar I saved went into that account, and my mother never contributed a single cent. I put myself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. I chose physical therapy because I'd volunteered at a rehab center during high school and discovered that I had a gift for helping people through the hardest moments of their recovery. After graduate school, I took a job at Oakwood Rehabilitation Institute, a 120-bed facility on the north side of town, and I started working 50 and 60-hour weeks because the overtime pay helped me chip away at my student loans and build my savings. I set up an automatic deposit of $300 from every paycheck into that old credit union account, and later, when I got promoted to senior therapist and my salary increased, I raised it to $500. I was saving for a house, a small house, maybe a 2-bedroom bungalow with a porch and a garden and a room I could turn into a library. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that cost $750 a month, drove a Honda Civic with 190,000 miles on it, and packed my lunches in the same insulated bag for 6 years. Every time my balance ticked past another $5,000 milestone, I felt a little more solid, a little more rooted in a life that was finally entirely mine. Tyler, meanwhile, was busy building a monument to failure. He'd dropped out of college after 2 semesters, tried and abandoned a series of careers: real estate, car sales, some kind of online marketing scheme that involved selling protein powder to people on Facebook, and run up debts that my mother always paid off. She remortgaged the Willowbrook house in 2019 to consolidate his credit card bills. She cashed out a small inheritance from her own mother to buy him a used delivery truck for a food delivery business that lasted 5 months. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, she'd wave me off and say, "You don't understand, Natalie. Tyler is sensitive. He needs support. You've always been so independent. You don't need help anyway." That phrase, "You've always been so independent. You don't need help anyway," became the refrain of my adult life. She said it when I graduated from physical therapy school, and she missed the ceremony because Tyler had a flat tire and needed her to call roadside assistance. She said it when I bought my first car, a used Honda that I paid for entirely with my own savings, and she didn't offer to help with the down payment, even though she'd just given Tyler $3,000 for a down payment on a truck he stopped making payments on 6 months later. She said it when I told her I was saving for a house, and she nodded absently and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," before turning the conversation back to Tyler's latest business idea. Every time she said it, the words chipped away another piece of my hope that she might one day see me as someone worth investing in. The first major betrayal came in the spring of 2022. I had been named Physical Therapist of the Year by the State Professional Association, an award given to one therapist annually for outstanding patient care and clinical innovation. The ceremony was at a hotel in Columbus, a formal dinner with 300 attendees, and I'd been invited to give a short speech. I called my parents the day I found out and invited them personally. My mother said they wouldn't miss it. I bought a dress, rehearsed my speech in front of my bathroom mirror, and spent the week before the ceremony in a state of nervous anticipation that I hadn't felt since my graduate school graduation. On the morning of the ceremony at 9:43, I got a text from my mother that read, "Sweetheart, I am so sorry, but Tyler had an emergency with his business and we need to be here for him. He's really struggling. We'll make it up to you, we promise. So proud of you." I stood in my hotel room with a curling iron in one hand and my phone in the other, and I typed back, "I understand. Don't worry about it." Then I went to the ceremony alone, accepted the award in front of a room full of strangers, and gave my speech about dignity and compassion and the power of small victories. No one from my family attended, not a single person. The second betrayal came through someone I trusted since I was 14 years old. My best friend Rachel had been my constant companion through college, my maid of honor at my wedding when I was 26, and the person I called when that marriage fell apart 2 years later, after my husband decided he didn't want to be married to a woman who worked 60-hour weeks and came home smelling of antiseptic. Rachel had always been my ally, but somewhere along the way, she'd also become close to my mother. I didn't think much of it at first. My mother was charismatic when she wanted to be, and Rachel lived in the same town. But then, about 6 months before the night in the hallway, Rachel and I met for dinner at a little Italian place near my apartment. Halfway through her pasta, she set her fork down and said, in a tone that was meant to be kind but came out rehearsed, "Natalie, I want to say something as your friend. I know you and your mom have your issues, but Tyler is really in a bad place right now. He's been talking to her about some debts he can't cover, and she's really worried. I think you should consider helping him out. You've got so much saved up, and he's your brother. Family helps family, right?" I stared at her. "Did my mother ask you to talk to me?" I said, and Rachel's face did that flicker, that tiny, involuntary twitch of guilt that told me everything I needed to know. I paid for dinner, I hugged her goodbye, and I drove home with the cold, quiet knowledge that my mother had recruited one of the few people I still trusted to be her messenger. I didn't call Rachel again for months, and when I finally did, the conversation was brief and hollow, and neither of us mentioned Tyler's name. But the worst betrayal, the one that still sits in my chest, like a splinter I can't quite dig out, happened 3 weeks ago on a Thursday evening in early November. I'd driven over to my parents' house after a 12-hour shift because my mother had called me the day before complaining that her arthritis was so bad she couldn't get to the grocery store. I had a rare day off coming up, and I decided, like I always decided, to show up. I let myself in through the side door with the spare key she'd given me years ago, the one she'd pressed into my palm after my divorce, and said, "You'll always have a home here, sweetheart." The kitchen lights were blazing, spilling yellow light into the dark hallway, and the rest of the house was silent. I could hear my mother's voice through the partially open kitchen door, low and urgent, the tone she used when she was discussing something she didn't want the neighbors to overhear. I stopped walking. Something in that tone made my stomach clench, and I stood there in the dark, my work flat silent on the linoleum, and I listened. The second voice belonged to Tyler. His voice was tight with panic, the kind of panic that comes when consequences are finally closing in and there's no one left to blame. "They're not going to wait anymore, Mom. The truck loan, the equipment lease, the back rent on the shop, it's all coming due at once. If I don't have $48,000 by Monday, they're going to take the truck, they're going to take the equipment, and the landlord is going to lock me out. I'll be done. Everything I've been building for 2 years will be gone." My mother's response was immediate, soothing, the voice of a woman who had been solving Tyler's problems for 3 decades and had no intention of stopping now. "Tyler, sweetheart, listen to me. I told you I have a plan. Your sister's savings account at the credit union. It's still joint from when she was 18. She never took my name off it. I checked online just last week. There's over $50,000 sitting in there right now. I'll go in tomorrow morning, withdraw the $48,000 and deposit it directly into your checking account. She won't even know until she checks her balance. And by then, your debts will be paid and you'll have breathing room. We'll figure out what to tell her later. There was a long pause. I could hear Tyler breathing, could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he processed the fact that his mother was offering to steal from his sister, and he wasn't going to say no. You really think she won't notice? He asked, and my mother laughed, a short dismissive exhale that I'd been hearing in different contexts my entire life. Natalie, please. She's got her big, important job at the rehab center. She's always working. She barely even looks at her bank statements. And honestly, it's time she contributed something to this family. She's always been so independent. She doesn't need help anyway. That money is just sitting there. You need it more than she does. The words hit me like a physical blow. She's always been so independent. She doesn't need help anyway. 11 words that crystallized 34 years of being the daughter who didn't require attention, didn't cause trouble, didn't ask for anything because I'd learned before I could walk that asking meant waiting and waiting meant never receiving. I stood in that dark hallway, gripping the grocery bag so hard the plastic handles cut into my palm, and I did not make a sound. I didn't burst into the kitchen. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't do any of the things my body was begging me to do. I just turned around, walked back out through the laundry room, set the groceries on the porch where she'd find them, got into my car, and drove home. The drive took 20 minutes, and I spent every single one of them in a state of frozen, crystalline calm. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I was in the zone I go into during a difficult patient session, where the emotion shuts off and all that's left is the next step, the next move, the thing that needs to be done. Because what my mother didn't know, what Tyler didn't know, what no one in that house had any inkling of, was that the bank account they were counting on had been closed for more than 5 years. I had walked into that credit union in the summer of 2019, 3 months after my grandmother died, and I had moved every single cent into a new account at a different bank, one that my mother had never used and could never access. The money was safe. It had been safe for years, and the woman who'd just promised to steal it was about to walk face first into a wall she didn't even know was there. If you're already gripping your phone right now, wait until you hear what happened next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a really good time to hit that button, because the part where everything flips is coming. I need to tell you about my grandmother now, because she's the reason I still have that $48,000. Her name was Natalie Cross, and she was my mother's mother, an 87-year-old woman who'd spent her career as a school librarian and her retirement tending a rose garden that was the envy of the entire neighborhood. She and I had always been closer than my mother and I ever were, because Grandma Eleanor saw things clearly. She saw the way my mother poured everything into Tyler and left me to fend for myself, and she never minced words about it. A few months before she died, when her health was failing, but her mind was still sharp, she called me to her bedside at the assisted living facility where she'd been living for the past 2 years. It was a cold January afternoon, the kind where the sky is a flat, pale gray and the wind rattles the windows, and Grandma Eleanor was propped up against her pillows with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm on the nightstand. She took my hand in hers. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was still strong, and she said, "Natalie, I've been watching your mother my entire life. I love her, but I know who she is. And I know that the way she treats you and the way she treats Tyler is not going to change. When I'm gone, there's going to be pressure on you to fix things for him. There always has been. You need to protect yourself now, before the pressure turns into something worse." I started to protest, to defend my mother the way I'd always defended her, and Grandma Eleanor squeezed my hand hard enough to stop me. "Listen to me," she said. That joint bank account your mother is on. You need to close it. Move the money somewhere she can't reach. I've seen this happen in other families. A parent with access to a child's money, a sibling in trouble, a moment of desperation, and suddenly the money is gone and everyone acts like it was never really yours to begin with. Don't let that happen. Close the account. Do it now while nothing's on fire. I sat there in that quiet room with the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of a television from the room next door, and I felt the weight of her words settle into my bones. She was right. I knew she was right. And yet the thought of closing that account, of doing something so explicitly defensive against my own mother, made me feel physically ill. I don't know if I can, I said. She's my mom. What if I'm overreacting? What if she never actually does anything? Grandma Eleanor looked at me with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing, and she said the words that have echoed in my head every day since. A family that only takes isn't a family, Natalie. It's a debt you never agreed to, and you don't have to pay it. That sentence burrowed into my brain and stayed there. I went home that night and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, turning Grandma's words over and over in my mind. 2 weeks later, I walked into the county educators' credit union and asked to speak with a manager. The process took about an hour. Because the account was joint, I couldn't remove my mother's name without her signature, but I could close the account entirely and withdraw the funds. The balance at that point was $43,812.37. The teller, a woman named Diane, who'd been working at the credit union for 15 years and who handled my paperwork with a practiced, sympathetic efficiency, issued me a cashier's check for the full amount. I walked out of the credit union on June 14, 2019, drove 25 minutes to a branch of a completely different bank, a regional bank that my mother had never used, in a town she never visited, and opened a new high-yield savings account solely in my name, with a payable-on-death designation that named a local animal shelter as the beneficiary. I told no one, not my mother, not my father, not Tyler, not Rachel. The secret sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and absolutely necessary. Grandma Eleanor died 3 weeks later on July 6, 2019, with me holding one hand and my mother holding the other. At the funeral, my mother gave a eulogy about what a devoted grandmother Eleanor had been, how she'd loved both of her grandchildren equally, and I sat in the front pew and didn't say a word about the account. The money stayed in my new bank, growing quietly with every automatic deposit, and by the time I stood in that dark hallway on a Thursday evening in November 5.5 years later, the balance had reached $51,640. And the account my mother thought she could raid? It had been a ghost since 2019. The morning after I overheard the conversation in the hallway, I woke up at 6:15 with a strange, calm clarity. I knew my mother was planning to go to the credit union that day. I knew she was going to walk up to the counter, present her ID, and ask to withdraw $48,000 from account 41125587. And I knew exactly what was going to happen when she did. I went to work as usual. I did my rounds, checked on my patients, spent 45 minutes helping an 82-year-old woman named Mrs. Henderson take her first steps after a hip replacement, and I waited. At 9:47 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It read, "Call me, now." "It's urgent." I didn't respond. At 9:52, she called. I let it ring 6 times and then sent it to voicemail. She called again at 9:56, again at 9:58, again at 10:03. By the time I checked my phone during my lunch break at 12:30, she had called me 22 times, 22 calls in less than 3 hours. I didn't listen to a single voicemail. I just smiled at my colleagues, ate my sandwich, and went back to my patients. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I got a text from my father. My father, who communicated almost entirely in nods and brief emails, who had never once initiated a difficult conversation in his entire life, sent me a text that read, "Natalie, your mother is very upset. Something about a bank account. Please call when you can." I didn't respond to that either. I finished my shift, changed out of my scrubs, and drove home with the radio off and the windows down, letting the cold November air keep me sharp. When I pulled into my apartment parking lot, my mother's car was sitting in the visitor's spot. She was standing next to it, arms crossed, face pale with a mixture of fury and confusion that I had never seen on her before. I got out of my car, and she started talking before I'd even closed the door. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I went to the credit union this morning to take care of something, and they told me the account was closed. Our account. The joint account. It's been closed since 2019. They said you closed it. You closed it without telling me. How could you do that, Natalie?" That was our money. I looked at her, and I felt a calm settle over me that was so deep and so complete it almost felt like peace. "No, Mom," I said. "That was my money. Every single dollar in that account came from my paychecks. You never deposited a cent, and I closed it 5 years ago because Grandma Eleanor told me to. She knew what you were capable of. She knew you'd try to take it someday, and she wanted me to be protected." My mother's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, and then a rage so pure it twisted her features into something I barely recognized. "Grandma Eleanor," she spat, "you're telling me my own mother told you to go behind my back, to steal from me? That money was in a joint account. Legally, half of it was mine. You can't just close it and take everything. That's theft, Natalie. I could take you to court." "You could try," I said, "but every deposit in that account came from my employer. I have the records, and I have a letter from the credit union confirming that the account was closed legally, with my signature as a joint owner. You don't have a case, Mom. You never did." I paused, and I let the silence stretch for a moment. "I know why you went to the credit union today. I know about the $48,000. I know about Tyler's debts. I was in the hallway last night. I heard everything." The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might collapse. You were in the house? I brought you groceries," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Because you said your arthritis was bad. I was standing in the hallway with a bag of food for you, and I heard you tell Tyler you were going to steal $48,000 from my account. You said, 'She's always been so independent. She doesn't need help anyway.' You said it like it was a compliment. Like my entire life of working and sacrificing and never asking you for a single thing was just an invitation for you to take whatever you wanted." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She just stood there, in the cold November air, with her mouth hanging open and her eyes wide and her entire carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. "I've spent my whole life being the daughter you didn't have to worry about," I continued, and my voice was starting to shake now, but I didn't stop. "I've never asked you for money. I've never asked you for help. I've never made my problems your responsibility. And your reward for that was to look at my savings account and see a safety net for Tyler. You didn't see my future, Mom. You didn't see the house I've been dreaming about for 8 years. You saw a pile of money that was just sitting there, and you decided Tyler deserved it more than I did." "Natalie, you don't understand," she started, her voice shifting into that high-pitched, desperate register she always used when she was caught in a lie. "Tyler's life is falling apart. These people he owes money to, they're not nice people. They've threatened him. I was desperate. A mother does crazy things when her child is in danger. You have to understand. I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand that Tyler made a series of terrible decisions. And instead of letting him face the consequences, you decided to fix it by stealing from your daughter. And it didn't work. The money is gone, Mom. It's been gone for 5 years. It's sitting in an account that you can't touch, at a bank you don't even know the name of. Tyler is going to have to figure this out on his own, and you're going to have to let him." She started to cry then, big theatrical sobs that I'd seen her deploy 100 times to get out of difficult conversations. But this time, I didn't feel the familiar tug of guilt. I didn't feel the urge to comfort her or fix things or smooth everything over. I just felt tired and free. "I'm not going to fight with you in a parking lot, Mom," I said. "Go home. Talk to Tyler. Figure out his mess without involving me. And don't call me again until you're ready to apologize. I turned around, walked into my apartment building, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel weak. I felt like I had finally done something to protect myself. But if you think that's where the story ends, you don't know how families like mine work. When a golden child is in trouble and the scapegoat refuses to hand over their blood money, the entire system turns into a pack of wolves. And the pack was about to descend. Within an hour of my mother leaving my apartment, my phone started exploding. The first wave was Tyler. He sent me 12 texts in the span of 40 minutes, and they cycled through every emotional manipulation tactic in the book. The first few were desperate and pleading. Natalie, please, I'm begging you. I'll pay you back with interest. I just need to get through this month. Please don't let them take everything from me. When I didn't respond, they turned angry. You've always thought you were better than me. You've always looked down on me. This is just another way for you to prove how superior you are. And then, when anger didn't work, they turned vicious. If anything happens to me, it's on your head. I hope you enjoy your stupid house while your brother is getting his legs broken. You're a monster. I read every single text, and I didn't respond to any of them. I just saved screenshots and forwarded them to a folder on my computer labeled Evidence. The second wave was the extended family. My mother had clearly spent her afternoon calling every relative she could think of and spinning a version of events in which I had stolen money from a joint account that belonged to both of us, leaving Tyler destitute and in danger. My Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, called me 3 times before I finally answered out of sheer exhaustion. Natalie, I am so disappointed in you, she said, her voice dripping with self-righteous disapproval. Your mother called me in hysterics. How can you be so materialistic? It's just money. Money comes and goes, but family is forever. You're really going to let your brother get hurt over a down payment on some condo? Aunt Carol, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, if it's just money, why don't you remortgage your house and give him the $48,000? There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Well, that's different, she stammered. I don't have that kind of liquid cash available. And besides, he's your brother, not my son. Exactly, I said. He's not my son either. He's a 29-year-old man who needs to face reality. Goodbye. And I hung up and blocked her number. My Uncle Dave called next, then a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, then my mother's best friend from church. Every single one of them had been fed the same story. Natalie had stolen money from a joint account. Natalie was selfish. Natalie was letting her own brother face violent criminals over a house down payment. Not one of them asked for my side. Not one of them paused to consider that maybe, just maybe, a 34-year-old woman who had worked 60-hour weeks for a decade had a right to keep her own savings. The third wave was the one that almost broke me. My father showed up at my apartment on Saturday morning, 2 days after the parking lot confrontation. He was wearing his usual weekend uniform of khakis and a polo shirt, and he was holding a manila envelope in his hands. I let him in, and we sat at my small kitchen table, and for a long time he just stared at the envelope without saying anything. Then he looked up at me, and his eyes were red-rimmed in a way I'd never seen before. Your mother asked me to give you this, he said, sliding the envelope across the table. It's a letter from a lawyer. She's threatening to sue you for civil theft. She's claiming that because her name was on the account, half of the money was legally hers, and you stole it when you closed the account without her permission. She's asking for $26,000. I opened the envelope and read the letter. It was from a local attorney, a man named Gerald Simmons, who had a reputation for taking on messy family disputes that no one else would touch. The letter was 3 pages long and full of legal-sounding threats, but as I read through it, I noticed something. The letter didn't cite any specific statutes. It didn't reference any case law. It was, as far as I could tell, a bluff designed to scare me into settling. I looked up at my father. Did you read this? I asked. He nodded slowly. I did. And what do you think? He was quiet for a long moment, and then he did something he had never done in my entire life. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, and started to cry. I think I've been a coward, he said, his voice cracking. I think I've spent 34 years letting your mother make every decision, and I've watched her pour everything into Tyler and leave you with nothing, and I never said a word. I never stopped her. I just sat there and graded my papers and told myself it wasn't my problem. He looked at me, and his face was so full of pain that I almost couldn't bear to look back. I'm sorry, Natalie. I am so, so sorry. You deserved a father who stood up for you, and I wasn't that father. But I want to be now. If she goes through with this lawsuit, I'll testify on your behalf. I'll tell the court what really happened. I reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you, Dad, I said. That means more than you know. But I don't think it's going to come to that. Why not? Because I've already talked to a lawyer, I said, a real one. And she told me that this letter is nothing but hot air. The money in that account came entirely from my paychecks. The law doesn't care whose name was on the account. It cares about the source of the funds. And if Mom tries to take this to court, she's going to have to explain, under oath, why she was trying to withdraw $48,000 from an account she'd never contributed to pay off debts that her son incurred with some very questionable people. That's not a story she wants on the public record. My father stared at me for a moment, and then slowly, a small smile crept across his face. It was the first time I'd ever seen him smile at something I'd said, instead of something Tyler had accomplished. You really thought this through, didn't you? He said. I had 5 years to prepare, I said, and I had Grandma Eleanor in my corner. She's the one who told me to close the account. She saw this coming before any of us did. My father nodded, and for the first time in my memory, he didn't try to defend my mother. He just sat there holding my hand and let the silence be enough. The family reckoning happened 2 weeks later at a dinner that I didn't plan and didn't want, but that turned out to be the stage on which the entire truth finally came out. My Aunt Carol, in a misguided attempt to heal the family rift, had organized a gathering at her house for the Saturday before Thanksgiving. She'd invited everyone. My parents, Tyler, me, a handful of cousins, my Uncle Dave and his wife, and even my grandmother's younger sister, Aunt Louise, who was 83 and sharp as a tack and had never been afraid to speak her mind. I almost didn't go, but my father called me the night before and said quietly, I think you should be there. I think it's time everyone heard the truth. And something in his voice told me he meant it. Aunt Carol's dining room was packed that evening. She'd set up extra folding chairs around her long oak table, and there were 16 people in total, 8 relatives from my mother's side, plus spouses and a couple of family friends who'd been invited for reasons I didn't fully understand. The atmosphere was tense from the moment I walked in. My mother was sitting at one end of the table, her face tight and her eyes red, and Tyler was next to her, looking simultaneously defiant and terrified. When I sat down at the opposite end of the table next to Aunt Louise, the room went quiet in that particular way that told me everyone had been talking about me before I arrived. Dinner was excruciating. We made it through the salad course with stilted small talk about the weather, and through the main course with an increasingly desperate discussion about Cousin Michael's new job. And by the time dessert arrived, the tension in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. And then my mother, who had been drinking wine steadily since this moment she sat down, slammed her glass onto the table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I can't do this. I can't sit here and pretend everything is fine when my own daughter stole $26,000 from me and is letting her brother get beaten by loan sharks. The room went absolutely silent. Every single person at that table turned to look at me, and I felt 16 pairs of eyes on my face, waiting to see what I would do. I set down my fork, took a sip of water, and said in the calmest voice I could manage, Mom, I didn't steal anything from you. That account had my paychecks in it, not yours. You never deposited a single dollar. And I closed it 5 years ago, legally, because Grandma Eleanor told me to. She knew you'd try to take the money someday, and she wanted me to be protected. My mother's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Don't you dare bring your grandmother into this," she hissed. "She would never have approved of you going behind my back. She loved me. She was my mother." And that's when Aunt Louise, who had been sitting quietly next to me with her hands folded in her lap, spoke up. Her voice was thin and reedy with age, but it carried across the table with absolute clarity. "Actually, Patricia," she said, "Eleanor told me about the account before she died. She told me she was worried you'd try to take Natalie's savings to bail out Tyler. She said she'd advise Natalie to close the account and move the money somewhere safe. She was proud of Natalie for doing it. The look on my mother's face was something I will never forget. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. All the anger, all the self-righteousness, all the carefully constructed victimhood. It just crumbled, and underneath it was nothing but shock and a raw, ugly humiliation that she couldn't hide. My Aunt Carol, who had been my mother's staunchest ally through all of this, turned to my mother with a frown. "Patricia, is that true?" she asked. "Were you planning to take Natalie's money without telling her?" My mother opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She just sat there, her mouth working soundlessly, looking around the table at the faces of her relatives and finding, for the first time in her life, not sympathy but suspicion. And then I said the thing that I'd been waiting to say for 2 weeks. I looked directly at my mother and I said, "You told Tyler I wouldn't notice. You said she's always been so independent. She doesn't need help anyway. You said it like it was a compliment, Mom, but it wasn't. It was an excuse. It was the excuse you've been using for 34 years to justify giving everything to Tyler and nothing to me." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My mother's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she was going to cry, but instead she just stared at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and devastation. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The room erupted. Aunt Carol turned to my mother and started asking rapid-fire questions about the joint account and the $48,000 and the threats Tyler had been receiving. Uncle Dave, who had called me 3 days earlier to berate me, looked at me with a dawning horror and said, "Natalie, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Your mother told us you'd stolen the money." She never said anything about Tyler's debts. Cousin Michael shook his head and muttered something about how he'd always known Tyler was a disaster. And through all of it, Tyler sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, saying absolutely nothing. My father, who had been sitting quietly at my mother's side all evening, stood up. The room quieted. He looked at my mother, and then he looked at me, and he said, "I've been a coward for 34 years. I let this happen. I watched my wife give everything to our son and nothing to our daughter, and I didn't stop it. I'm not going to be silent anymore." He turned to my mother. "Patricia, you need to drop this lawsuit threat. It's baseless, and you know it. And you need to apologize to Natalie. Not tomorrow, not next week. Right now." My mother stared at him like he'd just grown a second head. In all the years of their marriage, he had never once contradicted her in public. But he was doing it now, in front of 16 witnesses, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. She didn't apologize. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the house without saying a word. Tyler followed her, his head down, his face a mask of shame and resentment. And when the door closed behind them, something in the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It became something quieter, something that felt almost like relief. In the months that followed, the family realigned itself around the truth. My mother never apologized. She sent me a Christmas card that year with a generic thinking of you message and a $20 bill tucked inside, which I mailed back to her with a note that said, "I don't need your money." I never did. We haven't spoken since. I've made peace with the fact that she may never see me clearly, and I've stopped waiting for her to try. Tyler's life didn't fall apart the way he'd predicted. Without my mother to bail him out, he was forced to declare bankruptcy, sell his truck, and move into a studio apartment on the other side of town. He got a job at a warehouse, a real job with a regular paycheck, and last I heard he was actually keeping it. We've spoken exactly once since that night at Aunt Carol's. A brief, awkward phone call in which he didn't apologize, but did say, "I get why you did what you did." That was enough for me. My father changed. He started coming to my apartment every Sunday for coffee. He'd sit at my kitchen table and tell me about his week, and I'd tell him about my patients, and slowly, over months, we built the relationship we'd never had when I was growing up. He helped me paint the living room of the house I bought 6 months later, a 2-bedroom bungalow with a porch and a garden, exactly the kind of house I'd been dreaming about. And when we were done, he looked around at the clean white walls and the sunlight streaming through the windows and said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you." That was the only apology I ever needed. The house is mine, the money is mine. And the joint account that my mother thought she could use to bail out her golden child has been nothing but a closed file and a faded memory for more than 5 years. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that Thursday evening in the hallway, about how close I came to losing everything. If I hadn't listened to Grandma Eleanor, if I hadn't closed that account when I did, my life would look very different right now. But I did listen. I protected myself. And I learned something that I think every overlooked daughter needs to hear. You don't owe your future to people who only see you as a safety net. One wall calendar that never had room for my name, one joint account that turned out to be a trap, and a grandmother's words that echoed across 5 years to save me when I needed them most. If you've ever been the one expected to quietly hand over everything you've built so someone else could keep making mistakes, you know how heavy that expectation feels. But you also know how freeing it is when you finally decide that you are not a resource, you are a person, and what's yours is yours. A family that only takes isn't a family. It's a debt you never agreed to, and you don't have to pay it. What's some things you've protected in silence that no one saw coming? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear your story. If this video meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe to Reddit Drama Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.